Hi there. Welcome to the Maple Museum. I want to show you around just a little bit here. It could take me many days to cover everything, but we'll give you a sneak preview of what's inside this. Come along. First, we like to go around this way because that's sort of the beginning of time where we're going to see where the first people, how they made maple syrup, and I'll tell you briefly how it was discovered. This here would be a camp of the first people. This would be in the sugar bush where they are tapping, and it's a temporary shelter for the family to keep out of the weather and also boil their sap into maple sugar. Down here we have their very first evaporator that was used, and hot stones from the fire here would go into the boiling sap. Once they get cool, they put in new hot stones. And they'd put everything into maple sugar. Back then, that's the way they could transport it and save it from year to year. So we'd go from that era to boiling sap in kettles. When the first settlers came over, they would start about just using one kettle here, but they found that 3 kettles you could boil a better quality of maple sugar. Here we're still just talking about maple sugar. So you would boil the sap, or put the sap in one, then the second, and then the second, or the third one to make maple sugar. Maybe even from here you put it into a smaller pot, and then it would be ready to pour into birch bark containers or even hollowed out wooden containers to put the hard sugar in. Okay, we advance on another spot. During the First World War, this tin tubing is very early tubing. It was only made for a few years and went from tree to tree, saved a lot on labor, but it had its problems as well. Rain would get into it and limbs would fall out of the trees and damage it. So, but a lot of the metal had to go into war efforts, so it was not allowed to be made anymore. So as we come along, this here, first when maple syrup started to be left into maple syrup product, they had to have containers to put it in. The very early containers could be anything from wooden buckets to barrels, and then the plain sugar tins came along. But all of this row at the very bottom here is over the years, different companies made their own container with different designs on them. Some of them are pretty cool designs. Some of these are complete collection of every size that they had. There's a few that we're still missing. Up above we have maple syrup jugs and pitchers, whatever you'd want to call them. Some of them come from other countries. The fancier ones likely did come from other countries, and you would use them to pour your maple syrup onto your pancakes or waffles. As we go over here, some of the fancier ones, like these particular ones, would have to have been owned from a very wealthy family, I'd say from England or Ireland, Scotland, and they would have brought them over with them. Some of them are very, very old. Jump down here. We've got this little sampler's evaporator. A salesman would come along and with it in the case here, and this is a scale model. So you'd show your potential buyer the evaporator that they would receive. And these are pretty cool here. There's very few of them out there, but it's called a salesman's sample. And off here, we've got a woodworking shop. So in the early days, anything that you could use as a container was made out of wood. Sap spouts would be made in this little shop here. Wooden buckets would be made in here, wooden barrels. Got all the tools that you would use to make the containers that you would need for maple sugar. Even the trough up here, This here actually is the original trough that would have been used before they had metal. They'd hollow out one stick of wood and make a trough. This would be used to collect the sap from the storage tank into the sugar house or into the storage tank. Both of them were used for that method. In here, we've got a collection of maple nippers, different shapes and sizes. They were made to cut the little chunks or cut the bigger chunks of sugar into small chunks of sugar that you'd use in your tea. And off to the side here is a sugar devil, and you'd break up the sugar that would be stored in your barrels into sizes that you would need. Over here, collection of maple spouts, spiles, whatever you'd like to call them. Some of them even call them taps, but there's so many different sizes and shapes. The first ones are all made out of wood, of course, put a big hole in the tree, which meant a bigger damage to the tree by a bigger hole. And then different inventors come up with different sizes. Some of them are very unique and rare, so very hard to come by if you're a collector. But some of them were good ideas, some of them were bad. This one particularly, it was threaded at the end, okay? And you drilled a hole in the tree, and you had to use this wrench to give it a couple of turns in to make it really tight, which was sort of hard on the tree. Bad idea, really. Okay, and then of course we're getting into later years when the plastic was started to be used, which was quite a bit better. It would make a nice seal in the hole, and the hole in the tree would not be near so big. Okay, along here, just a little display of the way the sap was collected. The first people would put a gash in it here with a wooden axe. Another idea here. This was a little later when we had a little bit of metal to work with. Put this piece of little trough here, and then it would drip down into a container that sat on the floor, on the ground. This was very hard on the tree, and it very well could be after 3 or 4 years you'd start to see the tree would die back from this serious injury, because this whole area would be injured from this gash. Very hard on the tree, but in the early days they had lots of maple, they just move on to other maple. Then along came the settlers would come, and they were able to make wooden buckets, a little bit of metal band, okay, and a little spout, wooden spout, special little lids, different styles of lids. Along come when I was a kid, this is a typical bucket and spout that we would use. Worked very good, but back when I was growing up, we didn't have lids on them. It just meant that you had to gather the sap more often and always before it rained. And back when we seen the metal tubing, this is a display of the metal tubing that was used in around 1918 to 1924 about. Some of the very first tubing that was ever made, this is actually surgical tubing. Very expensive tubing, so they needed something different, and it wasn't long until they come with different plastic tubing, and this is basically the style we're using today. Smaller hole, and the tubing is different now too. One good thing about the tubing, squirrels and chipmunks don't like that later tubing as they did when it first came out. They just love chewing it. Different samples of sugar molds, everything from tin to metal. Now these were sugar molds, but you'd also use them as little cookie trays or jello or whatever. So many different designs here were made. And of course, everyone is different. Again, they would use for different things. When you come along here, we'll see bigger wooden sugar molds, and some of them made out of metal. These here are kind of unique because all these sugar molds were also designed for making maple sugar for the families, but this was good for the peddler that came around with goods. And it was important to the peddler to be able to get sugar from the farmer to take to the cities then, because he could make big money with this maple sugar. Back in the day when this was going big time, white sugar was very rare and hard to get, so maple sugar was the next best thing at that point. and everybody was able to make a bit of money with maple sugar. These smaller sugar molds here, and if you just reverse over to this, is a little better display. Each one of these are made hand carved, and all of them a little different. Everybody seemed to like to make the hearts. One thing I wanted to point out to you with this sugar mold here, this was the beginning when they, in the early days, back in the 1800s and earlier, they always made a heart with a crook on the bottom of it. This was like what your heart should look like. And then it wasn't until about 1900 that they started to make hearts, even Valentine's, that shape. So now you could tell the age of your sugar mold. Whereas this sugar mold here is worth an awful lot more money than the likes of this sugar mold down here with the heart like that, because of the age of it. Some of them very rough and crude, like this one is a very rough one. Even this is rough, and that makes it very unique and kind of rare maybe that's all the farmer could have time to make at the evenings at the stove while he's whittling. Got a couple of wooden sugar molds up here that are very rare. This was only a stick of wood that the farmer found in the bush, and he whittled out little sections to make molds for maple sugar. Very rough but crude, very nice. This is another one, the same thing. He must have found two hunks of wood about the same size. Different sugar molds like this. This rooster guy, this rooster is 2 pieces. And actually, you know how the fancy, say at Easter, you've got an Easter bunny and it looks perfect. Well, this would have been a complete mold for a rooster made out of sugar that would actually stand up itself. It's pretty cool. Everybody bragged in the early days about the sugar molds that they have, how great their carvers were to make different sugar molds. This one's a little different. It's like a bottle, but when it's together, it's a solid bottle. And the man's initials are on there, the carver. Yeah, then we get into the tin sap buckets. They started out, well, first off over here. Let's jump over here. These are the early wooden buckets. And you see how some of them had bigger bottoms like this. These would have been sitting on the ground, and the purpose of the big bottom is they wouldn't fall over the same. These are sat on the floor, on the ground, and bigger spouts would come and the sap would drip into them. Problem is they would not fit into each other, so they took up a lot of room storage. And then they come along with the idea of tapering them the other way. If there was a bit of ice in them, ice would come out of this bucket far better than it would out of the bottom of these. These buckets, if you had a little ice in it with sap frozen, you couldn't get, you had to break it to get it out. Something like this here was very early again. They didn't have a lot of metal, so they made the wooden bands out of wood, and they had a special way of locking them together. Some of the sap buckets, let's see, yeah. Some of the very early ones, I wanted to show you this over here. This here, because again, they weren't tapering them. The first sap buckets had the bottom was the same size as the top. So they would be made up of sets like these. They'd fit into each other, which made they could store it much better. I think the idea is the better trees. Everybody in the early days knew their trees. Some of them would run better than others. They would put the good runners, the big buckets on them, and maybe the slower runners, they put the smaller buckets. So there was different sets made up of different sizes. Pretty cool way of doing it. And then they came along with the tapered bucket that they could fit inside each other. Like most of these, bigger in top, smaller in the bottom. They fit into each other and you had to get them apart. Something I want to point out is the dummy bucket. Dummy bucket is a simple bucket. One side's one color, one side's the other color. Hole here, hole here. The idea was when the snow was gone and you couldn't see your tracks to the trees, you would be gathering and the horses would have the tank along the sleigh road, and then you'd look back every time you gather it, you'd have to turn the bucket around the other way. So if they're all gathered, it would all be one color. So it didn't matter. You didn't need to be real bright, and you could be a sugar maker. Same idea with this bucket, but the one little bucket that I wanted to show you was this one. This here is the sweetheart bucket. A hole there, nothing there. Hole here, but it's got a heart. This here was designed by, it was a husband and wife. They were getting older and a little bit slower. And the poor old wife, she didn't remember whether she went to that tree or not. So her husband went and he got a local company to make a bunch of buckets. They only tapped about 400 buckets. And made special buckets like this for her. And she now could not get it, she wouldn't get upset because she wouldn't remember whether she gathered the tree or not. So when they were all gathered, they'd either be a heart or no heart. So he simply called it the sweetheart bucket. These here, another set of buckets here. They're all made, they were actually made in Montreal at a factory that made oil cans, gallon oil cans. And this Second World War was on when this was taking place. And again, sugar was rationing, white sugar. So they needed more maple sugar produced for the troops to give them energy. Okay, so then the company got orders to put them into sap buckets. They were already printed, but put them into sap buckets. And for different oil companies. And this is kind of a cool thing to have because that was, the direction was under the power of the government. Pretty rare. Okay, we can go on and on. Somebody invented this great machine here. This was a bucket washer, and you just put the bucket over here, and they're always trying to make things easier and suit the conditions of what they had to work with. And this was a bucket washer. This down here, that is an actual sugar barrel. And the family would just have that full of maple sugar, and it would get hard. So they would have to loosen it up, like we said earlier, with a sugar devil. And then put it into smaller chunks, whatever the case might be. In the early days, as we seen the method of tapping the trees, it was done with a chisel. And then you'd put this little trough funnel into that mark, and then it would drip down into the pail. Then the settlers brought this big auger. Imagine putting a hole like that into a tree, but they did. There's many, somewhere here we've got a hole in an old block of wood that we got that was actually used for sugar auger to make a hole. Hard on the tree again, but it worked a lot better than the early method of putting a gash in the tree. Then come the bracing bit. A lot of hard work, but it worked not too bad. Then came the some of the chainsaws were made with a chuck on it. That's helped a lot in tapping the trees. This come actually after this big monster over here. This here is a big engine that sat on the, this is a backpack army type thing. You'd strap on your back and the engine would be behind you. You drill a hole in the tree with that. Maybe it made a little easier work, but got pretty heavy. Then came the battery. This is a car battery and a battery powered drill. And that jumps away ahead to what we're doing today with a small little tiny battery pack to tap trees. Yes, so anyway, we come to some, back in the early days too, snowshoes were kind of primitive. This type of a snowshoe here was called a tramper, and you basically just tramp the snow down. You put the younger people ahead to make a trail from one tree to the next, and the snow would freeze and it would be a little easier for the gatherers. And these are called bear paws. Very good, were used a lot in making maple sugar, gathering maple sap. So we go along, and again, whatever they had to work with, these are covers for sap buckets, and again, flattened out from used oil cans. License plates were actually used over there for covers. Metal was very scarce, so back in the day, you would use whatever you had available. to meet the need. Different thermometers to tell you what temperature syrup was boiling. That was one way of doing it, but not a great way. It would all night her up, and most of the sugar camps was so dark you couldn't read it anyway. So jumping way ahead here, I guess we didn't talk about the dippers. But this is really, a real sugar maker can make maple syrup perfectly with simple dipper to tell when the syrup is boiled enough. A dipper like this one right here, you just put it down into the maple syrup and bring it up, and you could be doing that constantly. See how the apron drips from it and then a drop comes off the dipper? You know pretty much whether that syrup is ready or not. And that's the way a lot of producers could tell whether the syrup was completely boiled to the point where you're just going to put maple syrup. And you could tell by the bubbles too that you're coming pretty close. So many different type of dippers. Skimmers too. This is a skimmer. This is actually a dipper. This is more of a tester because there's no holes in it. A skimmer was meant to take the goop or the froth off the top of the boiling sap, which we don't do anymore. You would skim it off. In the early days, that was very important to get rid of. You just keep skimming it off, throw it under the evaporator, and you didn't boil it over and over. Anyway, like I say, we could have go on here for years. Not years, I hope. But anyway, in here we've got a collection of the Maple Syrup Digest. It's a full, complete collection of how things progressed over the years and got easier. People designing things. It's all documented in some of these earlier ones. It started from back in the 60s to the present. A lot of maple history in there. Yes, so anyway, that's it for now.